When I was young, I used to watch a lot of Indiana Jones movies with my dad, and I got really interested in the idea of becoming an archaeologist. I was always really fascinated by the things that human beings leave behind, the threads that connect us all through time. And eventually I got that job as an archaeologist, and I ended up traveling all over the world. I excavated sites in Australia, in Mexico, in Hawaii, in Iceland, and I saw some pretty incredible things. I remember I was excavating this prehistoric Mayan village site in Mexico once. We'd been there for about 3 months, and it was hot, and we were excavating a lot of pottery. The thing they never tell you about archaeology in school is it's actually really boring. You end up digging up the same thing over and over again and bagging it and tagging it. Anyway, I pulled out this one piece of pottery, and there was a fingerprint on it. And all of a sudden, I was a time traveler. I could actually take that piece of pottery, and I could put my thumb in the thumbprint on the piece of pottery, and I felt like I had this direct connection to this person who made this pot 1,200 years ago. I think that was probably the best moment of my career. Unfortunately, moments like that in archaeology were far and few between. And I felt that what I needed was a more direct connection to history. I needed more of a sense of adventure in the discoveries that I was making. So fast forward to 2008, to London, and I was standing on a bridge over the Thames, staring at Battersea Power Station. This was the central power station for London from the 1930s to the 1980s. And I was standing on this bridge with a group of urban explorers, people who were enamored with the building. The building had been derelict for over 20 years. It was left to fall into a state of ruination and decay. No one was really looking after the building. And although we were incredibly fascinated by the building and by its history, we were also frustrated that we couldn't see what was inside the building. So we solved our curiosity in the obvious way. We hopped the fences, we snuck past the security guards, and we had a look for ourselves. And what we found inside was incredible. We found these breathtaking control rooms that used to be used to shift power across London, and they were in a perfect state of preservation. And I remember being, slightly terrified by what we were doing, but also I felt this immense sense of wonder. I was feeling this really visceral connection to the history of the place, and it reminded me a bit of being young. And any of you who have kids, I'm sure you've experienced this. The fascinating and also frustrating way that they just try things out without any thought really to what the goals or consequences might be, right? It felt a bit like I was rediscovering some of that childhood energy. So that moment in Battersea Power Station, it triggered something in me. It felt to me like what I was actually looking for when I was doing archaeology, I had found in urban exploration. I had found a more direct connection to the past, a connection to the past through exploration, through discovery, through adventure, right? This was the moment that I was looking for. So essentially, I had found that Indiana Jones moment, and what followed was my PhD research, 5 years of exploration all over the world with urban explorers into hidden environments. And eventually, that research would have very severe consequences, and that's the story that I want to tell you today. So soon after Battersea, we began sneaking into derelict hospitals that were dotted around London. And a lot of these hospitals that we went into, they were very surreal. It was like almost as if there had been a rapture or something, like everyone had just been lifted the day before. You would find sort of nurses' notes in the stations, and you would find patient records left behind. And you could do what you can't do in a museum. You could dig through all of these things, and you could look at them, right? You could touch everything. And we also explored derelict industrial areas in Detroit, in London, in Belgium, in Germany. And these industrial spaces were perhaps a little closer to us in the past. These are potentially spaces that our parents and grandparents worked in. And a lot of times you would find these pieces of machinery that were sort of too big to get out of the building, and they would get left behind. and these spaces were kind of collapsing and being reclaimed by nature. And we became slightly obsessed with getting these photographs of kind of intertwining nature and culture in these spaces. And then we kept traveling further east from London, and eventually we found the remains of the Soviet Union. And this particular photo here is from a village called Vogelsang. This was it was a Soviet military base that housed 12,000 troops at one time, and we found nuclear launch pads in this site. And when I went to a village that was still inhabited very close to here, and I asked people about the base, they had no idea that it was even there. So a couple of things occurred to me. I mean, the first thing that occurred to me is that a lot of these places that we had photographed just a few years on, they were annihilated. They were gone. They were knocked down and redeveloped into other things. And very often, the photographs that we had taken were the best forms of documentation that existed of these spaces. So you can imagine, as an archaeologist, I found this absolutely fascinating, right? That these urban explorers were doing this in their own time, and very often they were doing a better job recording these buildings than the government I used to work for, doing archaeology. But the other thing that occurred to me that I found equally fascinating is that we all tend to think that we live in a world that is mapped and known, largely because of Google. But it turns out that the world is still full of mysteries. The world is still full of places that are, for all intents and purposes, off the map. There are still places that can be found. However, as a researcher, I felt that it was important to add a level of critique to the discussion about what we were doing, and so I started talking to these urban explorers about whether what we were doing was really a kind of guerrilla archaeology, whether this was in the public interest, or whether what we were in fact doing was fetishizing other people's misfortune. Right? Was there something neo-colonial about this project? And it was in the context of that conversation that we were coming back from Eastern Europe, and we were scrolling around on Google Earth, and we found a ruin that would change our thinking forever. So basically what had happened is that in the 1970s, Antwerp started extending their metro system, but because of political issues, they never finished it. And we knew that the metro system existed somewhere underground, but we didn't know how to access it. So of course, Google Earth helped us, and we found this shaft in the ground that we thought might lead to that metro system. So again, there was only one way to find out. We abseiled down the hole. It ended up being 30 meters deep. When we dropped into the hole, we actually had no idea whether we were going to be able to come out again. But you know, if we knew what was going to happen, it wouldn't be exploration, right? When we got to the bottom of this 30-meter shaft, we had in fact found the remains of this metro system. And walking through here was incredible. There were a dozen miles of tunnel. There were 7 stations that were never put into service. I mean, it was a metro system with everything except the tracks and trains, right? It's an incredible discovery. And we had this conversation as we were walking through here about whether this was a ruin or an unfinished construction site. And we started having a discussion about whether we might be able to find similar things in London, right? There have to be secrets like this in London that we could find. So over the next couple of years, we came back to London and we started exploring all of these spaces. And I don't know if you remember that moment in the Wizard of Oz where they pull back that curtain and they find that this whole elaborate plot that they've been involved in, it was all controlled by, you know, a little old man pulling the strings. It felt a little bit like that, revealing all of the kind of secret inner workings of the city. But there was also, as we saw these places, we also gained great respect for these urban planners and engineers and architects who took incredible risks to build this infrastructure that cities now rely on. Of course, now today, we can build infrastructure like tunnels much more efficiently than people could 150 years ago when they were building the sewer systems or the tube in London. But we also build really boring infrastructure right now. It's not that interesting to look at. And when we went into some of the old infrastructure of the city, what we found is that it was striking. It was incredibly beautiful because I think because they were taking risks, they wanted to make sure that people wanted to see these structures. They wanted these structures to be seen, and of course, over time, we've forgotten them. So this became our mission, to kind of reveal the hidden structures of the city and to share them with people. So this is a London sewer system. This was built in the 1850s by Sir Joseph Bazalgette. The London sewers today were essentially old rivers of London, and they were covered over. This system is built out of 318 million hand-laid bricks, and it's absolutely gorgeous. But more than that, when Bazalgette built this system, there was a cholera epidemic in London, and by building this sewer system, Bazalgette saved millions of lives. I mean, Bazalgette is a hero of history, right? But the whole kind of history that he created has been buried under the city. So it kind of felt like, you know, in going into the sewers, we had revealed that man behind the curtain again. We also found electricity tunnels. So these tunnels have all the sort of telecommunications and fiber optics, and again, these are the threads that are moving all of our data and communication across the city. We found these old bunkers, these World War II bunkers that used to be connected to the tube. So during World War II, when the Luftwaffe were dropping bombs on London, they could evacuate people from the tube into these deep level shelters, and many of them still had the original signage in there. This space over here was pretty exceptional. That's called the Kingsway Telephone Exchange, and it was a telephone exchange built during the Cold War with public funds, and the public had no idea that it was being built or that it existed after it was built. And this would preserve all of the communications in the event of an attack, a nuclear attack on London. Of course, being in that bunker, I couldn't help but remember those launch pads at Vogelsang, right? And think about those threads that connect us, not just through space, but through time. But our imaginations in the city didn't just stretch down, they stretched up. Because in moving from thinking about the ruins of the past to the infrastructure of the present, we also started thinking about the future of cities, right? And the future of cities is always going to be a skyward prospect. And so we started climbing onto skyscrapers and revealing the views from various places, seeing bridges like the Fourth Rail Bridge that are incredible feats of engineering, up close and personal, climbing down them. And in 2012, we even climbed a mothballed skyscraper on Las Vegas Boulevard called Fontainebleau. And this photo here, I've basically stitched together 5 photos, and you can see me in the corner up there. But it's one of the most incredible views I've ever seen. A couple of interesting things happened when we started posting these photos. One was that other explorers started getting in touch with us all over the world, wanting to share their spaces with us. And so we started traveling and sharing information. But the other thing that happened is that the owners of these properties would very often get in touch and say, can we use your photos to promote our views? Or would you mind linking our website to yours because we see you're getting a lot of traffic, you know? Which was not quite the response we were expecting, but, you know, people understood why we'd want to see these views. So it would be great if I could leave it there, but unfortunately, this isn't an entirely happy story. We had been sneaking into the London Underground for a couple of years, into these abandoned tube stations. We basically took a 1932 tube map and we compared it to a 2012 tube map, and there were stations that were missing. Right? So we went to find them. And we photographed every one of these hidden stations. And Transport for London didn't appreciate this. Obviously, we had revealed certain security breaches in getting into these places. But more than that, there seemed to be a sense that Transport for London felt that these are their spaces. They own them. They didn't want photos of these things being published. So in 2012, I was coming back from Cambodia on a research trip, and my plane was stopped on the runway at Terminal 3 at Heathrow, and British Transport Police boarded the plane and arrested me. And while I was in custody, they took a battering ram to my front door and they confiscated all of my property, my computers, everything that could hold data they took from me, my computers, my hard drives, my phones. And of course, as a researcher, this was devastating for me, both because that research was necessary for me to sort of do my job, but also because I had confidentiality agreements with my project participants. We had certain guidelines in place that were being breached by the arrest. So eventually, I was charged, along with 11 other explorers, with conspiracy to commit criminal damage, which is classified as a thought crime. The British Transport Police wanted to stop us from exploring the city, and that's why they charged us with this thought crime. My passport was confiscated when I was arrested, and I was actually stuck in the United Kingdom for 2 years waiting to get to trial, where the case rapidly fell apart, as we all expected. So the backstory here is that I was actually invited to give this talk 2 years ago at Zeitgeist. And they bought me a plane ticket and everything. I couldn't get on the plane. And then they invited me back in 2013, and I couldn't get on the plane. They invited me back this year. And after some very intense legal wrangling, I was able to get out of the United Kingdom. Thanks, yeah. So I'm very happy to be home. It just remains to be seen whether it was a one-way ticket. Exploring cities is important, I think. Exploring in general is important. And you'll get now that it wasn't exploring or necessarily taking photos that got me arrested. It was sharing information. It was doing what I'm doing now. Right? Because in doing so, I exposed some faults in the security of the city, but I also raised a really important conversation, I think, about what we have access to and what we don't. There are boundaries being circumscribed around our existence in urban environments more and more, and one of the things that urban exploration has the capability of doing is a capability of revealing those boundaries. And I guess getting here, and going through all of the border checks and having flags put on my passport and my ability to travel limited, it occurred to me that many of us are living in prison all the time. Even though I didn't go to prison for what I did, my mobility was restricted, and I wasn't able to travel and do my job. And I think that, creativity is important. We all want to live in creative cities, right? Where people can push boundaries, where people can try things out, where people can make mistakes. And increasingly, we're living in cities where we're not able to do that. And so I think urban exploration, it speaks back to that in an important way. And it tells us that, exploring the world has the ability to reveal those boundaries, but also has the ability to make the city a more creative place, a more interesting place. And I think that these explorations that we undertook and the stories that we've been able to tell were worth it, despite the consequences. Thanks very much.